As we said in the introduction, the resurrection of Jesus is the foundation of Christianity. Without it, all of Christianity is a lie and a false religion. But unlike most miracle claims, Christians claim there is good historical evidence for the resurrection. So what is this evidence, and how can we use it? We already went over the basic underlying philosophy in the introduction, and pointed out that we already gave natural theology arguments for God's existence, argued the New Testament documents are reliable, and established miracles are not impossible. However, as we noted in the introduction, we will not assume the New Testament documents are inspired or even accurate in every detail. Instead, we will only argue from facts that are agreed upon by the majority of New Testament scholars and have good evidence to infer they are true. This means, even if the rest of the New Testament is a fabrication, it will not show these facts are false. Since even many skeptical scholars doubt the historicity of the entire New Testament, but at least agree these facts are true. So now, with this as our underlying foundation, we can begin to look at the historical evidence and see if it infers a resurrection. First, two underlying facts about the death of Jesus. It is almost unanimously agreed that Jesus died by crucifixion just outside of Jerusalem. Skeptical scholar John Dominic Crossan says, "This is as sure as anything historical can ever be." Skeptical scholar E.P. Sanders lists this as one of the most indisputable facts about Jesus' life. So there is no question for historians whether or not Jesus died by crucifixion. Second, it is widely agreed that Jesus was buried in a nearby tomb. The evidence for this is pretty overwhelming. We have multiple attestation from early sources, like Paul and Mark, and Josephus agrees crucified victims were allowed to receive a proper burial. Jewish law demanded that even foreigners and criminals had to be buried, and we have archaeological evidence for this as well. The burial account of Jesus also meets the criteria of embarrassment, since they had to admit they could not afford their own tomb to bury Jesus, but had to use the tomb of a member of the court who had just executed him. There are just too many facts which support the burial of Jesus. Only a few skeptical scholars in the Jesus Seminar deny this, but the majority does not, and we'll come back to this later and discuss it more. But both of these facts could still be true, and Jesus would still be dead in the grave. The real question is what happened next? What caused the events which followed and led to the rise of Christianity from a small backwater province in Rome? There have been a wide variety of theories that have been proposed in order to explain what took place 3 days after Jesus was buried. And in this video, we'll cover the four most popular and general theories to see which best fits the data. The first theory is the mythic theory. This is probably the most popular among layman skeptics. It argues that all the events and miracle claims of Jesus were made up at a later time and were not made up by early eyewitnesses. The disciples never claimed Jesus rose from the dead, and it was only made up by later Christians. The second is like the mythic theory, but it is called the conspiracy theory. Historical evidence suggests this is probably the earliest competing theory offered to challenge the resurrection account. It says that the disciples made up the story of Jesus rising from the dead and simply lied about it all for their own gain. Third, we'll look at the hallucination theory, which comes in many variations, and it's probably the most popular among skeptical New Testament scholars. It basically says that after Jesus died, the disciples were grief-stricken and had hallucinations or visions that Jesus had risen from the dead, and that propelled them to think he was alive again. And finally, we'll compare these to the resurrection theory, which is that Jesus actually did rise from the dead, and the disciples believed it because they witnessed it. So let's look at the facts and see if any of these theories can fully explain the data. The first piece is something that is accepted by almost unanimous scholarship, which is that after Jesus died, his disciples said he appeared to them again alive. There is not a lot of doubt among scholars that the disciples believe this had happened. Bart Ehrman says, "I don't doubt at all that some disciples claim this." Paul, writing about 25 years later, indicates that this is what they claimed, and I don't think he is making it up. E.P. Sanders says, "It is an equally secure fact that Jesus' disciples saw him, in what sense is not certain, after his death. Thereafter his followers saw him." The reason for this is because it has multiple attestation in various sources, including Josephus, and there is no way to explain the rise of Christianity if this did not happen. Something had to happen which compelled the disciples to begin the world's largest religion with seemingly nothing. Well, people claim they see all sorts of things, so why should we take the claims of the disciples seriously? How do we know their testimony is reliable and they were not simply making the appearances up? Well, in our previous series, we've already established the New Testament is very early and reliable in what it reports, so there is plenty of evidence their testimony is reliable. But putting that aside, we should at least evaluate when eyewitness testimony is unreliable. For instance, when events happen quickly or over a period of a few seconds, it is hard to retain memory of an event. Or when people go out looking for what they want to find. People that are desperately desiring to find Bigfoot will sometimes fool themselves into thinking they found something. Or when the participants are all strangers, like during a bank robbery. It is hard to retain memory when you are around unfamiliar people. And last, it is hard to retain memory if there was a weapon involved, for the simple reason that everyone is focused on the weapon and not anything else. However, if we examine the resurrection reports, none of these seem to be a factor. There is certainly not a weapon involved, and it is not with strangers. The disciples are familiar with each other and who they are witnessing they believe had risen. The disciples were also not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead. All the accounts embarrassingly report that the disciples had misunderstood the scriptures and what Jesus had claimed, and they did not expect him to come back. And the reports do not seem to happen quickly, but over a period of time, where Jesus would eat and drink with them and engage in conversations or give them instructions. Even if you could write off the Gospels and Acts as later myths, we still have preserved for us early creeds and oral sermons handed down which report these as well. So the reports on the surface level do not match circumstances that create unreliable testimony. As E.P. Sanders admits, they definitely experienced something, which doesn't bode well for the conspiracy theory.